So firstly, I'm going to introduce my PhD project with some information about the social psychological theory that goes with it. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about where we are with the climate crisis. So in her book, Hannah Ritchie says, if we stick to the policies we currently have in place, we're heading towards a world of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees of warming. Let me be clear, this is terrible and we have to avoid it. So as I'm sure we're all aware, these consequences range from forest fires to increased climate migration, and they need to be avoided if at all possible. So we know what we need to do to tackle the climate crisis. We've got the means to do it. Green energy has never been cheaper, and there's promising advances in nuclear fusion, and we've also done it before. So an example of recent social change was COVID-19, but for climate science, it was actually reducing the hole in the ozone layer. But what has psychology told us about how to avert the climate crisis before? So before, the focus was on the individual and on increasing awareness. For example, the information deficit model argued that by educating people more on climate change, they would inherently sort of start to take actions to reduce their own carbon footprint. So recycling, turning off the lights, or downloading an app to encourage us to emit less CO2. Which is all very useful, but is it actually getting to the root of the cause? So increasingly, there's been a recognition that no, this doesn't answer the whole this isn't the full picture. And that social identities, which is a concept that I'm going to come back to later on, plays a key role in concern for and belief in the climate crisis. So a meta-analysis by Hornsey et al. Found that political affiliation, which is an important social identity, had twice the effect on climate change beliefs than any other demographic factor. So in fact, this is arguably to do more with different vested interests by different groups. So you've got decision makers like governments, and you've got climate activists who have been increasingly taking more disruptive climate action to try and highlight the problem. You've got the general public who may be in agreement but are also apathetic to doing anything about it, or feel hopeless possibly to do anything about it in the face of such powerful vested interests. And you've also got decision makers and law enforcement agencies in the mix as well. So this is the problem. These vested interests and politicized identities can be seen playing out in headlines across the world. This is actually from the first time that Trump tried to withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Agreement. And there's now increasingly polarized debate on how to tackle the climate crisis in BRICS nations, which are the world's biggest emitters, and developed nations as well. So unfortunately, right now, we're still hurtling towards pretty serious climate breakdown. So this is the aim of my PhD project. It focuses on the interplay between the general public, climate activists, and decision makers using the collective action and minority influence literature within social psychology. So question one, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, is what motivates people to protest? When do activists use more disruptive protest methods? And how does repression impact willingness to protest and protest tactics? And question two and related questions are, what are the impacts of these protests on the general public? Is there an activist dilemma? And what about minority influence? So hopefully I will be talking a bit more about the second group of questions at a later Centre for CEE event. But I'm going to be focusing on the first group of questions as it relates to our research with Extinction Rebellion UK. Okay, so a little bit about the first question and sub-question and the social psychological theory that underpins this. So there are established pathways, important pathways to taking collective action. The first within the social psychological literature, the first is efficacy, and that's about the belief in the ability of a movement to achieve its political and identity consolidation goals. You also have participative efficacy, which is one's belief that their own involvement in the movement will help contribute to the cause. The second very important pathway is social identification to the movement. So humans form their identities on an interpersonal intergroup continuum, from a personal identity I to a group identity we. And if you identify with a group, you're willing to act on behalf of that group to achieve a group aim. And that's a really important predictor of it within the collective action literature. And then the third is injustice appraisals, or thinking about something as, or feeling and thinking that something is unjust. So related to injustice of appraisal, you have the more proximal, emotional or affective pathways to taking collective action. But first of all, maybe let's take a step back. So what is the importance of group emotions on taking collective action? What is an emotion, first of all? Emotions encapsulate patterns of activity across different bodily systems involving synchronized psychological, sensory, physiological and motivational changes that ready the organism to respond effectively to environmental demands. And what are they in response to? So they're in response to the appraisal of an event as self-relevant, followed by secondary meaning-making processes whereby the individual evaluates the event across several dimensions. For example, whether the event is fair or deserved. So emotions as a group member. Intergroup emotions theory states that when a social identity becomes salient, people react to situations which are relevant to group goals, even if situations have no direct bearing on the individual. So this gives rise to group-based emotions, and this is also from Tausch et al. 2024. And this is an example: feeling angry at a football match outcome which ended poorly for the football team you support, despite the result having no practical meaning for you as an individual. So there's evidence for differing affective pathways to different types of actions within the collective action literature. So in regards to the more proximal affective pathways to taking collective action, feeling contemptuous towards a group or groups has been found to have a system rejecting behaviour, and possibly leads to a willingness to take part in more disruptive actions. So this is whereas anger has been associated with more within action, system action. And this is exemplified by this quote, which talks about a paper by Tausch et al. So once contempt is included, anger does not uniquely predict support for violence. Rather, anger consistently predicted support for within subsystem actions such as non-violent protest or protest for in-group supporting policies, while contempt uniquely and consistently predicted support for violent action. So within the literature then, there are potentially different pathways that have been found between anger, feeling anger and contempt, to taking normative, that's sort of less disruptive collective action, and non-normative or more disruptive collective actions. So you can see here that the various sort of different types of collective climate activism that has recently been taking place. And as I've mentioned, normative and non-normative collective action. So normative collective action is sort of the more legal and ratified collective action, like, for example, protesting legally and not trying to kind of go up against the system, whereas non-normative is kind of doing what these girls did with the Van Gogh painting. I guess that's the most famous example in the collective action climate activism to date. So how does repression impact willingness to protest and protest tactics? So there's a couple of different options within the literature. The first is that it acts like a deterrent, and this is what the Conservatives thought when introducing the Public Order Bill. And as you can see, from reading the announcement, it was very clearly brought in to deal with climate activists. But actually, there's a second possibility, and that is that protesters may feel increasing levels of contempt, anger, and outrage, and this potentially galvanizes them to protest. So some of the psychological work suggests that this is indeed the case. So Iami et al. In 2021 did show that protesters in repressive contexts from Russia to Turkey felt more galvanized to protest the more they perceived the context as repressive. And actually, from the sociological literature, there is the third option, which basically points to an inverted U graph where repression galvanizes protest up to a point, but then it does indeed deter people. So interestingly, a study from that we did from the Big One protest, which was an Extinction Rebellion protest in 2023, we found an indirect path from perceiving repression to taking more non-normative collective action via increased feelings of contempt. So we wanted to assess whether this was the case in a bigger sample and test some other theory as well, which I will get into just in a minute. So this is the present study. It's a survey of climate activists subscribing to Extinction Rebellion UK's mailing list. And I work together with research collaborators from the universities of York, Yale, and Amsterdam, and also Extinction Rebellion UK. So the precursor to this study was that when we collected data for our first study, activists possibly didn't trust us as researchers as much as, say, if we were associated with the organisation and kind of working together with Extinction Rebellion UK. So in our first study, sample sizes were impacted, and that was kind of one of our motivations to work with Extinction Rebellion UK. But Extinction Rebellion UK is a really interesting organisation to work with. It's one of the most well-known climate activist groups in the UK. And in 2022, XR UK actually emailed their activists with a statement saying "we quit," which meant that they intended to stop disrupting the public by using tactics like blocking roads. So it's kind of a very interesting case study. And so going to talking about the study a bit more, for Extinction Rebellion UK, this was a health check of the movement, and they were interested in the same sorts of questions that we as researchers were. So in that vein, we created a mixed method study, both open text questions and survey questions from social psychological theory, and we asked about participants' past actions with XR UK, how much they perceived repression, how that made them feel, and their sense of beliefs that the movement could actually make a difference. So originally we got 1,650 participants, and after we cleaned the data, this left us with a pretty healthy sample size of 1,375. And we launched the study in December 2024, and it was open for a month. So it was closed on the 18th of January 2025. So I just want to give you an idea of the different types of emotions and the different types of efficacies that some of the activists told us in the open text questions. So the first quote shows kind of quite obvious dissatisfaction towards XR UK about its move away from disruptive action. And it says, "I felt like XR was kowtowing to the Tories, right-wing media and policy exchange by ruling out a proven effective non-violent direct action tactic and betraying people in their movement who had made sacrifices to try and appeal to ineffective, moderate environmental groups and NGOs so more people can go on another ineffective big march around Parliament." I think you can really get the sense that this is someone who is very frustrated with the movement. And then the second is sort of in a similar vein. But the third one is actually quite open to the idea that a move away from disruptive actions kind of can help build the movement. And it says, "I think these moves help to build a broad coalition with other groups, and we need to involve as many people as possible." And then the fourth one is kind of also in a similar vein. So this kind of gives you a nice little snapshot of what people were kind of feeling. And these were the themes that we picked up on when we just started looking at the qualitative side of the data. And for the survey, These were the example items that we have. So I'm not going to go through them all, but we have climate change worry, social identification with the pro-environmental movement, social identification with Extinction Rebellion, and perceived repression and collective action intentions, so the different types of collective action ranging from more disruptive to less disruptive types. If you'd like to talk a bit more about the items, we can do that after the talk. And this is essentially kind of a snapshot picture before getting into the sort of more inferential statistics. These are all mean indexes on a 5-point Likert scale. And basically the snapshot is that participants scored high, as you can see, on climate worry, perceiving repression, social identification with the environmental movement, and they had mid to sort of low scores on all three efficacies that we measured, and they scored relatively high on the emotions except for fear. So this was our hierarchical multiple regression with the Simca variables in model 2, repression in model 3, and in model 4, the more proximal sort of emotional predictors that we were interested in predicting the different kinds of collective action. So we ran a hierarchical multiple regression with 5,000 bootstrap samples. There were minimal changes in standard errors only, so we decided to just go with a normal hierarchical multiple regression. And we wanted to explore, as mentioned, the different emotional pathways from normative and non-normative collective actions, and to address a call to map effective and efficacy pathways in non-normative or more disruptive types of collective action. And we wanted to see if perceived repression and feelings of fear, contempt, and anger and outrage significantly add to the established Simca model within social psychology in a large-scale activist population. So this is basically what we found. These are the original Simca variables, and here we see that all of them, except for political efficacy, is basically doing what we thought it would do based on previous research. They've all got positive and significant effects on both normative and non-normative collective actions. And it's interesting that you can see participative efficacy has a stronger effect for more disruptive types of collective action, whereas identity consolidation efficacy, so that's the kind of efficacy where you believe that a movement can consolidate and build itself, is more related to less disruptive types of collective action. And we add to the model, you can see that repression also significantly, it's a small effect, but predicts both types of collective action. But interestingly, when we add the more proximal emotions, this effect is kind of wiped out. So this kind of suggests to us that these emotions could play a mediating role in perceiving repression and different types of collective actions. So that is what we did. We ran mediation analysis and got some really interesting results. Here, feeling contempt towards the criminal justice system, excuse me, partially mediates non-normative, so more disruptive types of collective action, but not less disruptive types of collective action intentions. And this is when controlling for past protest participation and all of the other Simca variables. Anger and outrage fully mediated both normative and non-normative collective action, but with a smaller effect for non-normative types of collective actions. So interestingly as well, feeling fear towards how the criminal justice system is treating climate activists in the UK partially mediated the pathway from perceiving repression to non-normative types of collective action only. So what does this mean? We found evidence for different effective indirect pathways from perceiving repression to different kinds of collective actions. So via contempt and outrage and anger to non-normative actions, and via anger and outrage to normative collective actions. And in this sample, identity consolidation efficacy is more associated with the less disruptive kinds of collective action, as opposed to non-normative action. So this echoes the sentiments of the Big One protest and their beliefs that this type of action would improve mobilization efforts. So there's a couple of conclusions that we can take away. Those who perceive more repression and feel more contemptuous and less fearful in our samples were more likely to indicate non-normative, so more disruptive types of collective action intentions. And in these cases, repression does act like a galvanizing factor, which is a really interesting finding. And this is, to add to this, there's some preliminary analysis that we've done that shows that those in the sample who reported actually having experienced repression, so people who experienced having been under surveillance, having been arrested, fined, or jailed, also reported increased, more disruptive collective action intentions. So this is really interesting because it provides an explanation for the increasingly disruptive tactics being used amongst climate activists, even after the introduction of the Public Order Bill. So that is my kind of current research and what we've been focusing on up until now. I just want to quickly talk about the future directions, and this was, based on our talks together, but also on what we've observed within the sample. So this move away from more disruptive types of collective actions has got some of the activists asking questions, and I'm just going to read out one quote here. I think the direct action was getting too much negative press, but I feel they have not replaced it with anything meaningful. So this is what we'd like to explore further going on into the sort of second half of my PhD, exploring when normative and non-normative collective action tactics mobilize a third-party audience with a large-scale longitudinal experiment, and we'll be looking at some of the same variables that I've mentioned here, so repression, types of protest, and the representativeness of the group to society. And then in a smaller experiment, which we're just currently running at the minute, we are assessing group power perceptions to see if this impacts people's opinions of taking more disruptive types of protest. Okay, I think that's been me talking for long enough, so thank you very much for listening.